Hey gang, Will here from the Ashland Fly Shop, and today we're going to do something we've been meaning to do for a long time with our video series, and we're going to take a really close look at Versileaders and Polyleaders and what these things are and how they apply to different types of lines and rods, single hand, two hand rods. There's a lot of confusion about these light tips, and so we're going to take a real close look at them here for you today. Really, this discussion should probably just start with the name of these products. So Versileaders and Polyleaders. And really what you're talking about there is the difference between Airflow, the brand Airflow, and the brand Rio. And there's certainly other types of these lighter tips out there, lighter leaders out there, sinking leaders. But these two brands pretty much own this product. So when we're talking about Polyleaders, we're really talking about Airflow, the Airflow product. When we're talking about Versileaders, we're talking about the Rio product. It's pretty much as simple as that. A very simple way to look at them and to think about them is just if you think about your standard knotless tapered leader that you have, whether for steelhead or trout, just your standard knotless tapered leader, and you think about that mono leader coated with tungsten material or with a plasticized floating material, there you have it. That's your poly or your Versileader. So it's a lighter coating than you're going to find in some of the more substantial sinking tips. And also there's typically a taper to them. So that's the way I explain them a lot of times to our customers is they're a tapered, which makes them a little different from a standard sinking tip. And they just kind of have a lighter coating, which achieves kind of a lighter sink. Also, their grain size is smaller. So really, we only stock Polyleaders that run up to about 75 grains or so. Whereas so if you take a 10 feet T8 tip, you're looking at an 80 grain tip. So it kind of meets right around there. Versileaders, the heaviest Versi or Polyleaders is gonna be still underneath some of what we would consider a lightweight standard sinking tip. So on the flip side of that, therein lies the advantage of these things. They really are nice for lots of different applications. So let's just start with the single hand fly fisher. So we sell a lot of these to guys that have a standard weight forward floating line and they're going to the lake for a couple weeks. They don't maybe do a lot of still water fishing, and they've got a canoe or they're fishing from the bank, and in a lake or even in a river, if you want to fish a small streamer or something, having some kind of sink tip is really an advantage. Okay, great. So you can grab a light 10-foot Versileader sinking or a heavier 7-footer. You can loop it right to the front of your fly line, and boom, you have like kind of an instant multi-tip system. On a single hand outfit, if you have like a 5-6 weight, something like that, and you put the heaviest 10-foot Versileader on, no doubt you're going to notice a little bit of hinging, a little bit of kind of a clunky casting of that, because those standard weight forward lines, they taper down. So if you're putting a sink tip on the front of that, you're going to find that it's going to cast a little funny. But the advantage is you're going to get that sink out of it. But it's not really designed like a standard multi-tip line where the fly line's got a different type of taper. It's just going to be a little clunkier cast. Don't expect it to really take the place of like a standard like type 6 10-foot sinking tip integrated line. That's always going to be I think a better choice for sink. A standard fly line that comes in 10-foot, 15-foot, sometimes even 20-foot rates. Those integrated lines are just beautiful for getting, really getting the sink you want. But again, Versileaders, Polyleaders, a very quick fix. And I think you'll find that you'll achieve probably the sink that you want just with the Versileaders. They work very well that way. Okay, let's talk about Versileaders and Polyleaders and how they apply to Trout Spey lines. So now we get into a broader category, and I find that they're almost a mandatory item at this point. So we have Trout Speys that start at 2 weights and go up to 5 and 6 weights. And you know, they just work for all of them. In fact, when we do our Trout Spey packages, we typically start people off with Versileaders and Polyleaders as their tip selection. They really just work that well. So we have a lot of very short Skagit heads now, you know, Skagit heads in the 12, 13, 15 foot range. Your floating polyleader just works great on those to extend that out and create a different type of fly line, maybe kind of a la carte a Scandi. We have wonderful Trout Spey Scandi type lines, the Rio or the SA Spey Scandi Light, the new Rio Trout Spey, the Scandi Body from Rio that we love, and these work great with floating polyleaders. These heads just fly. They just punch these things out there. So whether it's a Rio floating or the Airflow floating, either one, they're just phenomenal, those floating varieties. And those heads, the Skagit Trout Spey heads, as well as the standard Trout Spey heads, more Scandi type tapers, they take those sinking Versileaders very, very well. I only typically see them start to balk when you really get a decent fly on there and you're really trying to get it out there pretty far on like a 4 or a 5 weight. You know, that 7 inch per second, 10 foot standard Spey Versileader with a pretty decent fly on the end, you know, with a more of a Scandi style taper head. It gets a little, it's kind of a lot to get moving, but still it'll work. So if you're getting into Trout Spey, if you're looking for a tip selection, you want to expand it, really those work, the Versileaders and Polyleaders work very, very well. Okay, let's talk about Versileaders and Polyleaders and how they apply to our more standard Spey outfits, you know, from 12 to 13 foot rods. They're really, really designed for Scandi heads. That's, if you look back, it's probably where they really come from, honestly. So the 10 footers, they just work beautifully on your Scandi heads. We have more aggressive, shorter Scandi heads now in that kind of 28 to 32 foot range. They just work great. So if you needed to lengthen that out for any reason, or if you wanted to use a floating poly in the place of a standard knotless mono leader, then you would look at the floating poly or Versi Beautiful. They just work perfectly on there. Really, really a nice choice, and then you just tip it out from the end of that. And then they'll also take the sinking varieties as well. Now this is where you want to be a little bit aware of how much of a tip or Versi or poly leader you're putting on the front of that. So, you know, the 7 inch per second 10 foot standard Spey Versileader, you're probably going to want to put that on more of a 13 foot 7 or 8. You know, it's just going to require, you know, that really pointed energy to kick that thing out. Obviously, we're all assuming here that you're using a smaller, more traditional style fly. You start getting into the modern articulated bugs, even lightly dressed ones, they're going to have a little bit of trouble kicking those over. So you can play around with them for like switch rods, like the sink tips, using them as sink tips on switch rods, on lighter switch rods in the 5 weight, 6 weight range. But really your Versileaders and Polyleaders are going to match with your Scandi heads for your Spey rods. Okay, let's talk about the floating poly leader and Versileader. This, I feel, is probably the most unique in these products and why we carry 2 different brands in this. We are really partial to the Airflow floating poly leaders. The material is clear to kind of opaque. It is a very, very nice material. It sticks to the water very well. And as far as an anchor when we're using our Scandi heads and stuff, which is where we would use a floating poly leader, Versileader mostly. So the Airflow material we find is really a really nice material for floating. Rio Versileaders, the floating, are very nice as well. It's just more of like a standard floating tip, like a plasticized fly line type material. So nothing too unique there. Works great. Works fine. I just think that the Airflow material seems a little bit more user-friendly. It seems to stick to the water in a way that I like. I will make a a note about this on the floating side. If you are transferring a lot of energy in your two-hand casting and your Scandi casting, and you really make just a really tight loop, great timing, you're probably just going to go crazy for polyleaders, because the way that they really pitch out there and really make a nice V-loop going out. I will say that for more of a novice caster, I tend to fall into that category a bit. I do like more of a 12-foot or 15-foot just standard knotless leader. I find that I have a little bit harder time really kicking out that longer poly leader. And I think it's just because of the added material, the added matter basically on the tip. I'm pushing more out with my cast. The energy has to be more pointed, more precise. That's just my personal experience. But I would say if you're struggling with polyleaders, struggling to get that last turnover, that last kick on like a 14 or 15-foot leader, especially if you're fishing like a decent sized waking fly or something, you might just jump back into a 12, 14, 15-foot knotless steelhead leader and give that a try. You might find that that's just going to kick out a little bit easier for you. That's a note that that I've seen between the floating and the Versileaders versus the standard mono leaders. So your sinking Versileader variety are going to run from a single hand application, the 7-footers. They run about 50 grains, plus or minus on the size, and then your 10-footers, either in the light Spey or the standard Spey, they're going to run in around the 80 grain range. There are poly leaders. I think Airflow has a few that are a bit heavier, but we think of them fitting comfortably in that kind of 75 grain range for a 10-foot sinking Versileader. So you don't see that noted quite as much in the Versileaders, but I think that is a good thing to know. We're all looking a lot more at grains these days when we're putting our line outfits together. So that's about the size range that they run. So let's talk about the Versileaders and polyleaders that we carry here at Ashland Fly Shop, because we don't actually carry them all. So let's start right with the floating. So we love the Airflow floating polyleaders. They're great. We love the material that they're made from. We like them in the 10-foot floating variety and 8-foot for trout fishing, light trout fishing, for fishing dry flies. Awesome for Trout Spey Scandi heads, the floating variety for fishing dries. And then for your standard Scandi heads on your standard Spey outfits, the floating ones are great. They come in a 14-footer floating. We sell tons of those. You can tip that out to 16 feet or as long as you want. You can cut it back and make a 12-footer. They're great. Those are great. We also carry those in intermediate too, those Airflow ones, because they're very nice as well, and they're nice and clear, and the taper is really nice on them. From there, we carry again the 7-foot sinking for the single-hand trout folks. We carry that up to the 7-inch per second. Works great. From that 7-footer, we go right into the 10-foot light Scandi with a 24-pound break strength. That could also be used for single-hand rods. And now you're getting into your lighter Trout Spey rod. So that 10-foot light Scandi Versileader in the floating through 7-inch per second. That's a great Versileader or tip for your Trout Spey single hand rod, and also for your lighter Scandi heads, lighter standard Speys. And then from there, we're into the standard Spey Versileader from Rio, which has a bit more mass to it, a bit more punch. We carry that in the floating through the 10-footer as well. Floating through the 7-inch per second as well. And that's your 75 grain tip or Versileader. And that's going to be the most sink that you can probably get from your Scandi outfit. And those are pointed at more standard traditional length rods, 12 to 13 foot, 14 foot rods. Okay. You got it? That's the Spey Versi Poly Leader talk that I've been meaning to do for a long time. And If I left anything out, which I'm sure I probably did, please, any questions you have, we're happy to go through it. We really appreciate the feedback. People are using these in all kinds of unique ways. We'd love to hear how you're making use of them, but they are a very versatile item. We get a ton of use out of them. I have a pack like this thick of them in my tackle bag, so they work really well, and we hope you find enjoyment out. We hope that untangles that just a little bit for you, so thank you very much.